Wild Beast's title was made by critic Louise Vauxel, who was amused by the exaggerated color in their art. Fauve is French for beasts, because the artists of the movement, the first art revolution of the 20th century, were said to paint less like men and more like animals. All of the qualities of the picture, other than just the line and the color, everything which the rational mind of the painter has not controlled, everything which comes from our instincts and from our nature. Fauves created in their works a visual experience rather than a mirror held up to something else. They set painting free from the academic conventions of realism and even of the expressionists' need to capture the sensory experience of a place or event. Van Gogh inspired Vlaminck, most Van Gogh-focused color being powerfully expressive of emotion, and he laid it on the canvas in strong, purposeful marks. Maurice and Andrea Dobson went out painting together and shared the same studio only a year after they had met. The first Van Gogh exhibit inspired them by the colors. Fauvism was gradually subsumed into the canon of modern art, but its influence liberated the use of color for future generations of artists who ultimately explored color as an abstract subject in its own right. The saturated colors of Fauve paintings, all created between 1904 to 1908, were not descriptive of nature. The painting's bold strokes had an existence mimicking surface appearances. It was the later exhibition that critic Louis called the Fauves wild beasts for their bold color and impulsive manner, too unrefined. Fauvism was not a formal movement with a manifesto of rules and regulations. It was an instinctive coming together of artists who wished to express themselves by using bold colors, simplified drawing, and expensive brushwork. Les Fauves simply believed that color had a spiritual quality, which linked directly to your emotions, and they loved the use at the highest possible pitch. Light and atmosphere are the primary influences of the Fauves, but history sees the Fauves in a much more positive way. They were the first to see painting in a truly modern way, as more marks of pigments on the canvas, including bold color. On our next slide, I will tell you my opinion about Fauvism and what other people may think about Fauvism as a whole. Many critics say that Fauvism is violent, and I have to disagree with this because I do think that there is some violence to it, but not in a bad way. The colors are trying to trick you into thinking that this is not normal. That grass is not supposed to be red. It's supposed to be green because it's your natural instincts. And the colors are very obnoxious, and it confuses you, and many viewers do not like to be confused. They like to see art as majestic and real, and this is not the case that they want it to be. Many people don't like change. They don't like difference. And this was the very first art movement that really changed your perception of art. And this is why people did not necessarily like it. But going beyond that, Fauvism is about emotion, and it's not about what it is supposed to be. Although the grass outside your window is green, this opens you into your mind into a new world and makes you actually think about what art is. On the next slide, you will notice the methods used by the Fauves. Color initiated nature. Color that dared to tint human flesh pea green and tree trunks a violent red. Color that not only refused to initiate nature, but was used to suggest form and perspective. Form seemed to grow spontaneously out of the pure vivid hues, blood reds, sunny yellows and oranges, and electric blues. These brought their highest pitch and unified in mastery dynamic harmonies. The saturated colors of Fauve paintings, all created as descriptive of nature. The painting's bold strokes had an existence mimicking surface appearances. When the Fauves used brushes, the marks that they had made were aggressive daubs of unalloyed color rather than brush strokes. The colors were often unblended, without the subtle shadings that suggest it to be 3D. The Fauves sometimes squeezed paint directly out of the tube and directly onto the canvas. They did this to make the color very bold. Unnatural colors were used to describe a scene. Nude colors were not used for skin tone, for example, while the greens and reds often took the place instead. Strong blue, red, and fluorescent green heightened a sense of assertive and unnatural beauty, while the sycamore is frequently used like a pen stroke to instill some form into the colorful mayhem of the Fauves. On the next slide, you will notice a link. If you click on this link, it will be of a video including all of the Fauvist paintings. Fauvism. In this painting, you will notice that the trees and the grass are actual greens, just like the ones out your window. In this, the grass and the trees are red and gold, which are not very natural. In these self-portraits that are coming up, you will notice that some are blended and the facial features are very hard to make out. These brushstrokes are very sharp and particular. These are not. The unnaturalistic colors are combined and blended throughout of the Fauvist paintings. Notice how in almost every single one of these paintings, the colors are very unnatural. In this painting, the strokes that are used are very, very sharp. In this, it is very blended and hard to make out. Self-portraits were not often done by several of the Fauvist artists. Many Fauve artists like to focus mostly on landscapes. On the next slide, you will learn about Maurice de Vlaminck, living 1876 to 1958. Maurice de Vlaminck, tall, strong, and muscular, already a larger-than-life figure and a fabulous fabulist, would later claim with the exaggeration that he was really the first to embrace the new style of Fauvism, and then the first to abandon it. Vlaminck was a younger and especially daring exponent of Fauvist exaggerate of color and dashing brush texture. He painted with thick, glossy strokes and slapped on with gusto to create canvases drenched in light, their extreme violence tempered by delicate shadings. He continued to apply his color, which dominated by combinations of the three primaries. He squeezed colors out of the tube, producing flat color zones as pure and vibrant as could be. He was noted for his brush temperament and broad interests. He was at various times a musician, actor, racing cyclist, and novelist. He was also a self-taught artist. He adapted to be a more subdued palette and turned to painting landscapes with solid compositions. Van Gogh inspired him most. He focused on color being powerfully expressive of emotion, and he laid it on the canvas in strong, purposeful marks. He was inspired by Van Gogh's powerful brushwork, use of intense, non-naturalistic colors. From the fall of 1905, he moved to artistic maturity, which was swiftly and decisive. By the next spring, he had become the third major Fauve painter. After the unexpected contract with Vollard in 1906, Vlaminck had much enthusiasm. The summer of 1906 was his happiest and most productive of his entire career. After World War I, he left Paris and moved to the countryside, where he painted mostly rural scenes in a dramatic yet mannered style. Maurice painted as other men threw bombs, one critic commented. This was mostly because of his bold color that he exhibited throughout his career. He set up his easel on the banks of the Seine near Chateau and achieved with the sheer spontaneity of the original Fauvism of the ebullient force of his color. The emphatic pictorial opens an expansive flatness characteristic of the mature Fauve synthesis. From 1917 at Vladimir's, where he bought a house, Blumnack painted canvases that summarized his whole way of seeing. They show his favorite subjects under a violent light, a road, a few houses, trees tossed in the wind. The same country roads appear repeatedly in his paintings, which are executed in Ile-de-France and later in the Perche region. Blumnack played the violin in cafes and cabarets surrounding the exposition complex and finding himself appalled at just how many Parisians were in fact able to enjoy his gallery. He continued writing while working as a painter. By the beginning of the century, he had published 3 novels in collaboration with the Sonata. Blumnack, once one of the most consistent Fauves, turned to brown and gray-toned works of a systemized vivacity. He also continued to write poetry, fiction, and memoirs as he illustrated a number of books. On our next slide, you will see a painting called The Orchard, which was done in 1905 by Maurice de Blumnack. De Blumnack specialized mostly in his landscape paintings. His landscapes, for example, in this one, were used with primary colors. It is very hard to tell in The Orchard what the painting is of. On the left side, is it a tree or is it something else? The viewer may see any different kind of thing. In the back, is it water or is it grass? It is very hard to make out. His primary colors, which include red, orange, and yellow, are often brought to the front of the picture. In the back of the picture, you can see the dark and the light blues. This painting in particular has many swirls and dabs. Blumnack liked to bring his canvas, tubes of paint, and paintbrushes to a scenery, which was outside. He would paint the landscape, and it would take him a very, very long amount of time. He did this with most of his landscape paintings. On our next slide, you will see our second analysis, done by Maurice de Blumnack. It is called Champs du Bleu and Restaurant at Bougival. This was done in 1905. If you notice, you can see the immense daubs and the blendedness of this painting. This is because of the paint that he used directly out of the tubes once again. He did this in most of his paintings, but this one he used most of all. This painting is one of his most famous. Maurice has a very special quote for us, saying, "Looking from the maximum color, I squashed and crushed tubes of blue and vermilion. I wanted to make it as hard and intense as I could." The intensity in the color becomes very apparent to the viewer. He used unnatural colors, including reds and bright oranges, for the grass. He often used reds for tree trunks, which he included in this painting.
Our next artist's name is Andrea Dobson. He lived from 1880 to 1954. Just a brief history about him: he experimented with many different forms and styles of art. He did paintings, sculptures, he illustrated books, was a stage designer, and a collector. He was friends with Braque and Picasso, and they shared an interest in Cezanne and African sculpture, and these artists later went on to start the Cubist movement. In 1908, he actually destroyed most of his work to focus on tightly constructed landscape paintings, which were an investigation in Cézanne's work. And during World War I, he made masks from shrapnel and bullet shells. Shortly before World War II, he made small clay sculptures using earth from his garden or landscape sites, and these were many-colored masks and figures. He collected exotic and African treasures, Greek, Roman, and Renaissance sculptures, East Asian art, paintings, rare books, and curios. His interest in composition eventually led to his break from the Fauvist style to experiment more with Cubism. And just before his death, he built sculptures in different sheets of metal. So next we'll talk about Derain and how his ideals influenced his Fauvist style. So a quote from him talking to Matisse, he says, "I sincerely believe that we ought to aim for calm. This calm is something of which we can be certain. Beauty, then, ought to be an aspiration towards this calm." So he believes that a calm, serene scene, like that's what's beautiful, not something that's exploding everywhere and it's huge and flashy. So he shows that in his paintings, which we'll talk about later. He also believed that the world is equally spiritual and material, and that painting should mix the two to offer to human understanding a reality that otherwise escapes the senses. So by mixing the spiritual and material things of life, we get kind of an alternate reality that we don't normally get to see. So that's mixing the everyday scene with the bright colors of the Fauvist style. So these ideals led to the main theme of his paintings, called mundane realities. So they include rows of trees, low houses, small villages, rivers, cities populated by laborers. So it's not big mansions or flashy volcanoes or something, just something that you would see in everyday life. But he also mixes that with the bright colors of the Fauvist style. So here's one of his paintings. It's called Big Ben. He painted it in 1906. So here we see the bright colors and the bold brush strokes of the Fauvist style. Obviously, the sun and the sky don't actually look like that. The Big Ben is not actually blue. But the scene itself is very mundane. It's anything that anybody in London would be able to go out and see with the boat and the river. It's not anything crazy. So he believed that that was what was truly beautiful and what they should try to paint. So now we'll focus on how Derain was able to mix his mundane reality concept with the Fauvist style. They seem to kind of contradict each other, but he was really able to make it work. So in 1905, he was commissioned by the art dealer Ambroise Villard to paint London. There's a movement to modernize the city after the mechanical industry took off and led to a huge growth in population. So in the next slide, you can see some of the construction that went on. The slide after that is an early picture of the London Bridge. So after that, Derain decided to paint his painting called London Bridge in 1906. You can see the bright, shocking colors of the Fauvist style that are obviously unnatural, but you also see the everyday scene. So on the next slide, you see the strong brushstrokes are really evident in the water. There's blots of yellow and green and blue that kind of mix to create the overall effect, but when you look closer, you can see the individual paint brushstrokes. On the next slide, an example of the unnatural colors is really evident in the red sky and the blue buildings, obviously very unnatural. But if you go to the next slide, you see the overall painting again, and you can see how the scene itself, if it was regularly colored, would be something that anybody could see in London with the bridge, the people, and the river and the boats. Very natural, very everyday type of reality. But then the pop of color with the red sky, the blue buildings, the green and yellow water really makes it something different. It really makes you notice the different aspects of the scene as opposed to, oh, that's just something that I would see every day. So that's what Derain was able to do through all of his paintings, mixing mundane realities with the Fauvist style. So next we'll look at Mountains at Collioure, painted in 1905. So Derain painted another mundane reality. This isn't like London Bridge, where it's a city with the boats and the people and the bridge. This is more of a natural setting, but it's mundane reality in that anybody, nice day, go on a picnic, any area that's more rural, more country, like in Europe, you could probably see something like these mountains, the trees and the river and the grass. It's not something that's super exciting, but he made it exciting with these bright, flashy colors of the Fauvism style. And the next page, those colors are really evident in the orange and the blue of the mountains. Obviously, mountains are not orange and blue. And also the green sky is very unnatural. On the next page, those brushstrokes that we see in the Fauvism style are really evident in the trees. Each leaf has its own new stroke, and he mixes the blue and the green, it looks like a little orange and yellow is in there too, to create the colors that he wanted that are really popping for the viewer. And also, if you look in the foreground at the river, it's choppy. The brushstrokes aren't even touching each other in most places, so that really shows the Fauvism style with those strong brushstrokes. So if you go back to the original painting on the next slide, we see again how it's a natural setting and it's one of his mundane realities, but those bright colors really make it pop and really make it special. And so those colors, they weren't intended to be as emotional as colors have been emotional for other artists such as Van Gogh. The blue of the mountains does not mean that the end of the world is coming, and the orange does not mean that it will come by blowing up the sun, but they are just kind of what he felt like these mountains should look like. Those just kind of what he wanted the colors to be. So the next slide, his contribution to Fauvism overall, he stayed true to the bright, unnatural colors and the bold brushstrokes of Fauvism, but he used his desire for calm beauty in his work. So he uses those common, mundane reality, everyday sights that we saw, and the calm nature, such as mountains and Collioure. So he mixes his own desire for calm beauty with the Fauvism style of the bright colors and the strong brushstrokes.
Our next artist is Georges Rouault, who lived from May 27, 1871 to February 13, 1958. He was a French Fauvist painter and also used to work with stained glass. Rouault was born in Paris into a very impoverished family, and his mother encouraged his love for the arts. In 1885, at the age of 14, Rouault began working with the stained glass. That is where he truly learned to love art, and when he was sent on errands, he would actually save the bus fare to buy paint. While working with the stained glass, this exposed him to techniques like contouring and using heavy black lines, and this truly affected his work. Shortly after, in 1891, he entered the official art school of France. There he studied under Gustave Moreau and quickly became a star student. By working very closely with Moreau, he was introduced to people like Henri Matisse and some of the other Fauvist leaders. In 1905, he exhibited his paintings at the Salon de Temps with a few of his other Fauvist friends. Critics have claimed that Rouault embodies a more spontaneous and instinctive style than some of the other Fauvists. Rouault's style is significantly different than most of the other Fauvists. He still uses bright colors. However, these colors are more of a bright blue or bright green, as opposed to the warm, bright colors of some of the other Fauvist painters. He also mixes his media, usually switching between watercolor and pastel when painting his paintings. In 1917, he actually devoted his life to the Christian faith and that of the variety. Immediately following, he uses a lot of religious figures in his work. After the death of his teacher Moreau, he started painting scenes of immortality and redemption. In many of his early paintings, he has been known to paint portraits and people. After that brief period of time, he started painting still lifes and landscapes. On our next slide, we have Circus Performer, painted in 1906. Rouault is best known for his religious imagery. However, he also painted characters living on the fringes of society. He thought that circus performers were intriguing. To create this painting, the artist mounted a picture onto canvas that he drew. After this, he layered on thick, colorful paint. This unique process allowed the artist to create more emotion within the painting by adding depth. On the next slide, I've zoomed in to get closer to the arm. In this area, below the hand, you see spots of orange, and off to the right of the hand, you see spots of yellow. In the skirt,
there are a variety of blues used. This unique combination was often done by this artist. In this painting, watercolor was used, along with a variety of pastels. Within, you can see noticeable brushstrokes, along with a technique that appears to be splattered and messy and uneven. This is very typical of the Fauvism style. On the next slide, towards the chest area, more oranges are used, and along the top of the skirt, a wider range of blues were used. On the next slide, I have displayed a tabarin, painted in 1905 by Rouen. Tabarin in Italian means nightclub. However, but in French, it means charlatan, a seller of medicines who might advertise his presence with music and an outdoor stage show. In Spanish, it also means a chatterbox or a talkative person. I believe Rouen related most directly with the French version of the word. The person in the photo appears to be dancing. Dancing for what? I'm not sure, but I'm going to let you decide. On the next slide, I've focused in on the black lines. I believe this is heavily drawn from his experience working with stained glass. In the arm, there's also heavy contouring used. There are bright blues and hues used as well. This picture also appears to have been done very quickly, in a sort of messy style. Within the painting, you can clearly see the brushstrokes used, all very typical of the Fauvism movement. Our next artist is Henri Matisse. He lived from December 31st, 1869 to November 3rd, 1954. He was a French artist who usually painted, but sometimes he sculpted. Towards the end of his life, he started cutting out construction paper and combining shapes to create other sculptures. He was very close friends with Pablo Picasso and Marcel Duchamp, who revolutionized the plastic arts. He is widely recognized as a leader of the Fauvism movement and a leading figure in modern art. Matisse was born in France to a family that sold grain and paint. In 1889, he developed appendicitis, and his mother brought him paint to keep him busy. After this experience, he learned to love art. In 1905, he worked closely with Andrea Dobson at Couleurs, a commune in the southern region of France. Shortly afterwards, he worked in the Salon de Temps with the other Fauvists. While painting under the Fauvist style, he endured severe criticism. Not a lot of his paintings were purchased, and therefore that put a burden on his family. He often changed his painting style. I believe the poverty is partly why. He studied under many teachers, some of them being Cezanne and the Neo-Impressionists, along with the symbolist painter Gustave Moreau. Also happened to teach plenty of the other Fauvists. Like I said before, Matisse is known widely as the leader of the Fauvism movement. He often used flat shapes and controlled lines to add his own signature onto the movement. Matisse loved the idea of using bright and expressive color to illustrate the world with how he viewed it. This is shown on the next slide with the painting Lux comme un volute, painted in 1904 by Matisse. The image was mostly flat with the depth of field in the front. During this time period, he was just coming out of his pointillism style. He uses bright reds, purples, blues, greens, and yellows in the sky to display how he saw it. Also, the people are blue, purple, and yellow. This is unnatural. And may be unsettling to some viewers. This is one of the first paintings that he painted in the Fauvist style. Some styles of pointillism is still used in this painting. However, the dots are quite large, therefore alluding that it does not belong to the pointillism style. In the next slide, I have zoomed in on the people, along with the mountains, the sky, the sand, and the teapot. Colors used are from a wide spectrum, all along the color wheel. Some of the shapes of the people are not completely drawn in, and their figures look slightly distorted. One can easily see the brush strokes inside of the painting, and the subject is not usually painted what most people are used to. The next painting is Open Window, painted in 1905 by Henri Matisse. In this painting, Matisse has fully immersed himself in the Fauvist style. The brushstrokes are slightly more clean and not as pointy as the other ones. This painting was widely revered for its diminishing coherence of form. This image is of the commune in Couleurs. It is the view out of his window. The color is keyed up and has been distorted. On the next slide, I have zoomed in on the terracotta pot. The usual terracotta orange has been amped up to reveal a bright fiery red. Along the left side of the painting, you can view clear brush strokes. A variety of color is used in this painting as well. Towards the top right, there is ivy sprawled across the terrace. This ivy does not appear detailed at all, almost slapped onto the painting as an afterthought. However messy this painting is, I still believe that each part has been planned out very carefully. Critics' responses to the Fauvism paintings were varied. Some enjoyed it, but most thought that it was appalling. The people who enjoyed it thought that the artist used pure color in the most fascinating of ways. The people who thought differently thought that it was assaulting to the eye and was used to convey sensation and not realism, which was different from those in the past. Later critics of the Fauvism movement claimed that they had taken the controlled expressionism of Art Nouveau and the passion of Van Gogh and combined the powers of color and line with the color science of Seurat and the visionary symbolism of Gauguin. I believe that that's very interesting. During this time period, the public seemed to be enamored by these wild colors used by the Fauves. The Fauves had issues getting into salons, so they ended up starting their own so that they could display their work and almost rebel against the other salons. Now, grouped together, these paintings probably seemed to almost jump off the wall with color. Many conservative art critics were very appalled by the pure color. In some, the paintings sparked joy, adding interesting colors to otherwise bland subjects. Many conservatives thought they were messy, but original, highly personal, and emotive. Louis Vaucel happened to be one of the conservative art critics who gave the Fauvists their name. Upon seeing all of these Fauvist paintings grouped together in one room at the Salon de Tom, he exclaimed in French, something along the lines of Donatello among the wild beasts. Wild beasts in French is easily translated into Fauves, thus giving the Fauvists their name. Louis Vaucel, there was only one statue in the room, and that was of Donatello, a very conservative piece. Vaucel claimed that he was relieved to see this, among so much color and ingenuity. He also said this, "I admit to not understanding. A nude, ugly woman is stretched out upon grass of an opaque blue under the palm trees. This is an artistic effect tending towards the abstract that escapes me completely." He said this afterwards, in 1907, closer to the end of the Fauvist movement. This is an interesting quote. Looking back now, the Fauvist paintings aren't completely abstract. However, in this time period, the abstract was just anything beyond conservative. Due to the proportions being wrong within the painting, Vaucel claims that this woman is ugly, and he points out that grass is blue, under palm trees, where usually grass doesn't grow. This quote sums up the Fauvist movement very easily. Everything just seems a little bit off with what he's describing, and afterwards he just sits there and claims that he's confused, which is a very common reaction to the Fauvist painters. Fauvism is the first modern movement in which color reigns supreme. Like I said before, many of the critics thought that this was appalling and assaulted the eye. This is because as humans, we perceive color like taste. Our brain reacts certain ways to certain colors. The person viewing the painting thinks the art is strange because the form is right but color is wrong. Like the sky is supposed to be blue and it looks like a sky, but it's actually red. Most viewers were more used to the traditional art, where both form and color were right or representational. Breaking the confines of this box that the art world had set itself in caused some people to react negatively. People usually don't like change, and they also don't like it coming so suddenly. By breaking these confines, though, this led to increased confidence for other artists to break out of social norms that were placed upon them by the art society. The creation of Fauvism set the building blocks for many other artists to pave their way in the art world. I believe that the critics' responses only helped fuel this fire. When someone tells someone that they can't do something, this usually makes the other person want to do it more. This ends up causing the artist to use more daring techniques in their daily work. People like Louis Vaucel, a conservative art critic, helped push the Fauves to break even more boundaries as they kept on painting. These artists of pure color used critics' responses to adapt and change their style into even more interesting movements.
So next we'll talk about what caused the Fauvist movement. it was right after Post-Impressionism, where artists such as Seurat and Van Gogh turned away from the Impressionism and the goal to capture the visual effects of light and atmosphere. And to do this, they used a technique called pointillism, which is using little dots of different vibrant colors right next to each other that blend in the eye to create the exact color that they wanted, which ended up being more vibrant than if they had just mixed the color using paint. So on the next slide, we see a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, painted by Seurat in 1886. So we don't see individual dots of color. What we see is general, almost muted colors, but it's kind of fuzzy, especially evident in the trees and the water. But if you zoom in on the bottom right corner, we zoom in on the dog, and we see that it's not actually just plain brown, it's actually some white, tan, black, and brown all mixed together with little dots right next to each other, so when you look from far away, all we see is the general brown color. Same with the grass. It's actually white, green, some blue, and tan all mixed together, but when you look from far away, all you see is the green. Now, Matisse didn't like how this pointillism technique, it made the overall image muted, and the individual colors were lost when you looked at it from a distance. And this helped the Fauvist artists develop their style of using the bold brushstrokes and the paint straight from the tube. And this really showed the vibrancy of the individual colors, and they weren't lost when you put them next to each other. So another influence of the Fauvist movement was African art, which was brought to Europe as the result of imperialism. And this art was really almost primitive. It had really simplified forms. The human figures were kind of flat and had fragments. They didn't really look like reality, which showed a more conceptual approach to constructing the image. And African art only had one formula for translating life into art, which was basically do whatever you want. And so on the next slide, we see some of the masks that the Fauvists might have seen, and we see the really bright colors and how the faces don't really look like reality, but you can still tell it's a face. It had a more simplified form as well. So next, how did the Fauvists even find this art? So the story is that it was Paris in 1905, and Vlaminck saw 3 African masks in a cafe, and he was struck by their, quote, expressive power of instinctive art. And so he bought the masks and brought them to Matisse and Derain, and they all really enjoyed these masks, and they thought that they had, quote, a freedom that Western art did not, because art at the time was Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and it was really just paint what you see, and they really didn't enjoy that. They wanted more freedom in their art, and so this African art was really a light bulb that went off for them. So on the next slide, we see more of the masks that they might have seen. We see the bright colors that might have had symbolism with those colors, and we see the simplified construction. So these artists were awed by how the art came away from the idealized beauty that they were used to, by showing the malformations and the symbolism in the colors and the construction of the masks. Another thing that really helped the Fauvist painters was that they were the first to benefit from changes in the visual art society. One of these changes was the art dealer, and they really helped to get the Fauvist work out into the public and to get their name noticed. And so they would collect a bunch of different types of art and sell it around to different people. And so this helped the Fauvist art get all over the country as opposed to just in their one area. And also, the art buying public, before they would just go to a museum and see art, but now that they were buying it, this obviously helped the Fauves gain money to be able to travel and go around and paint new things, but also it, with the word of mouth, it really helped them to get their name out there. As well as new exhibition facilities. So like in the story where the art critic comes to the exposition facility and sees all the Fauvist art at the same time and calls it Fauve, which is wild beasts. That just shows how having all of their work in the same area at the same time really brought that big impact that they were looking for. And that helped them to get their name out there and to really have people notice them. So even though Fauvism was just a short blip in the history of art, it was one of the first in a succession of avant-garde movements in the 20th century art. So avant-garde means new, unusual, or experimental ideas. So really, they brought a huge change to 20th century art. And it directly led to Cubism through painting forms in an unnatural way and the use of uncontrolled colors. It really expressed a freedom in design that wasn't there before. And so Fauvism focused more on independent color, and Cubism focused more on independent form. So like in this next painting, by Georges Braque, he was originally a Fauvist and then moved on to start Cubism with Picasso. So on the left we see one of his Fauvism paintings. We see the bright colors and the bold brushstrokes. And then on the right we see one of his Cubist paintings, which apparently is supposed to be a guitar. I don't really see a guitar, but that's what it's supposed to be. So on the left we really see that freedom of color, and more freedom of the brushstrokes and expression. Whereas on the right, the freedom of expression comes from the freedom of the shape. Whereas you may not be able to tell what it is, but to Braque, it's a guitar. And so those shapes really bring out his freedom of expression. So on the next slide, so Fauvism helped lead to more modern art concepts, like how color and form are more independent of each other, and they didn't have to rely on each other. They could be totally separate. So some of the Fauvism aspects seen in modern day art, it was really fearless and bold, which is, we see a lot of modern art taking those big risks. And it's not constricted by reality. Any art you go see in a modern art museum now, a lot of it does not look like real life, and that's something that Fauvism really started. It also has a lot less detail now that art is more simple and not taking hours and hours and hours to paint every tiny little detail. And also, Fauvism started this idea that color represented the state of mind of the artist rather than the color that it looked like in reality. So that means art now represents more of how you feel rather than what you see. So a quote from Van Link about this, he said, "Transposed into an orchestration of pure color, every single thing I felt. I translated what I saw instinctively, without any method, and conveyed truth, not so much artistically as humanely." So Van Link is saying how his art was basically just based on what he felt, and not really restricted by reality. So the Fauvists were one of the first groups to question reality in their art, and they helped start the idea that art didn't have to make sense or be pretty anymore. So on the next slide, we see an example of this that we learned about Marcel Duchamp. This is his piece, Fountain, he made in 1917. On the left is a picture of him. So this is obviously a very bold choice, using a urinal as a piece of art. And though we might not know this for sure, I think that Duchamp was really influenced by the Fauves and their bold choices that they made. On the next slide, we see Christo and his piece, Running Fence, on the left, and on the right is a picture of him. And he also made very bold choices, something he made, it took him 4 years with a ton of help, a ton of legal things to do, but he really had to make this bold choice to do this, and really fight for the right to make this piece. And I think that he was influenced by the Fauvists and the bold choices that they had to make, and how they changed art so that it didn't have to be so one-dimensional. It was not constricted by reality anymore. On the next slide, we see Tyree Guyton and his project, the Heidelberg Project, on Heidelberg Street in Detroit, and it is still an ongoing project. And you see his use of bright, bold colors, and he obviously just paints what he feels. It's not constricted by reality or what this house is supposed to look like. We think that houses are supposed to be plain colored and not covered in polka dots, but this is just what he felt like painting, which is much like the Fauves, who just painted whatever they felt like.